The sea is vast, it stretches beyond sight, an endless expanse of shifting blue and grey. Imagine standing upon the deck of a Viking longship in the 9th century. The creak of timber echoes beneath your feet, the boards bending slightly with each passing wave. Salt spray stings the lips, cold air burns the lungs, and above, gulls circle briefly before disappearing, as though even birds know how far from land you have come. Around you, only the horizon, infinite, eternal, merciless. The ocean was both a highway and a prison. For the Vikings, it was the only path to wealth, to glory, to distant shores unknown. But it was also the realm of thirst, hunger, and despair, a paradox of freedom and suffering, beauty and terror. The longships glided like knives across the surface, yet within them sat fragile men, utterly dependent on one another, utterly dependent on the few supplies they carried. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the scene, not as history, but as lived experience. The sail is raised high above, patched linen stained from years of voyages. The oars rise and fall in rhythm, the wooden handles slick with sweat. The men's arms ache, their breath heavy, their mind sharpened by repetition. And yet, within their chests, an unspoken dread grows stronger each day, the creeping fear of thirst. Water. Fresh, clean water. It seems so simple when you stand on land, streams running down hillsides, lakes shimmering beneath the sun, rain filling barrels beside farmhouses. But here in the middle of the North Sea, surrounded by endless salt, it is the one thing that cannot be found. Saltwater tempts, it gleams in abundance, but to drink it is to die. The Vikings knew this truth better than anyone. They could endure storms that rip sails apart, endure enemies with axes and swords, endure nights so dark, the stars themselves seemed swallowed. Yet thirst was their silent conqueror. It came slowly, gently at first, like an invisible enemy. Lips would crack, tongues would swell, the mind would grow hazy. Strong warriors, hardened by years of raiding and fighting, would stumble like children when the body lacked what it needed most. Now imagine, in that vast and desolate place, the sounds of the sea, the crash of waves against the bow, the groan of the mast as wind tears at the sail. Beneath it all, the steady beat of oars slapping water. But among those sounds, there is something quieter, more haunting, the whispers of men. They speak in hushed voices about the days since they last saw rain. They calculate how long their casks will last, how many gulps remain, how many mouths may need to be denied. This is the true heartbeat of a voyage, not the clash of steel, not the cry of gulls, but the measured, desperate hope of surviving thirst. Picture the faces of the men aboard. Some are young, eager, their first voyage still fresh with wonder. Others are old, bearded, hardened, having crossed these waters countless times. Each face carries a story, yet all share the same sunburn, the same salt-crusted hair, the same longing glance toward the horizon. They do not fear the sea monsters spoken of in sagas, nor the wrath of foreign kings. They fear the quiet death that comes from within, the slow fading of life when the throat runs dry. The North Sea itself was a strange companion. At times it lay still and shining, a mirror for the sky. At other times it rose in fury, black waves climbing high enough to swallow ship and crew alike. The Vikings respected its moods, for they knew it was alive in its own way. To cross it was to bargain with a god, to beg mercy from forces beyond human control. And when the sky darkened with clouds, the men did not complain. They opened their mouths, stretched out cloaks, and prayed that the storm would bring rain rather than ruin. For those listening now, in the comfort of stillness, the terror of such a voyage might seem distant, almost unreal. But to a Viking sailor, the sea was not an abstraction. It was the road to destiny, and destiny required sacrifice. It required leaving behind the safety of fjords, the laughter of family, the warmth of hearth fires. It required trusting that the gods would grant rain, that casks would hold, that provisions would last. And always it required confronting thirst, that most human of needs magnified by the endless salt around them. There is a certain rhythm to life at sea. Days blend into one another, marked only by the rising and setting sun. Men row until their arms ache, then rest while others take their place. Meals are taken in silence, dried fish chewed slowly, hard bread, softened with what little drink remains. At night some sleep, while others keep watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of land or storm. In those quiet hours, when the world is dark and the ship creaks against the current, a strange thought creeps in. Perhaps the sea has no end. Perhaps they will row forever, chasing a horizon that always retreats. And yet, for all its cruelty, the sea held beauty too. Imagine standing at the bow at dawn, mist rising from the waves, the first light of day turning the sky gold. The air is sharp, pure, untouched. Dolphins leap in the distance, their bodies catching the light. The horizon burns with promise, and for a moment the men forget their thirst. For a moment they believe they are chosen, destined to conquer whatever lies beyond. This mixture of despair and wonder, suffering and beauty, it was the essence of the Viking voyage. As we begin this story, remember that what we call history was once lived experience. These men were not characters in a saga or names in a chronicle. They were flesh and blood, with fears, with dreams, with families waiting at home. Their struggle against thirst was as real as the waves that beat against their ship. To understand how they survived, we must not only learn their methods, but feel their journey. We must step onto the deck, taste the salt, hear the wind, and know the desperation of an empty cask. The horizon stretches still, the ship moves forward, the story of survival is about to unfold. Before we can understand how the Vikings endured the hardships of the sea, we must first understand why they risked such journeys at all. To modernize, the decision to push fragile ships across uncharted waters may seem reckless, almost unimaginable, and yet, for the Norse people of Scandinavia, the choice was not one of luxury or idle adventure. It was a choice born of necessity, of hunger, of ambition, and of a deep cultural yearning that shaped their entire existence. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, when longships cut across the waters to raid monasteries on the coasts of Britain and Ireland. But the roots of those voyages stretched deeper into the soil and stone of Scandinavia itself. The land of the Norse was both beautiful and brutal. Towering fjords carved by glaciers, pine forests stretching into mist, mountains capped with snow, even in summer. It was a world that inspired awe, but it was also a world that demanded resilience. The soil was thin, rocky, and often unforgiving. Farming was possible, but it yielded little compared to the fertile fields of England or the river valleys of France. The growing season was short, winters were long, and hunger was a constant shadow. Families tilled the earth with care, but the harvest often barely sustained them through the cold. Herding livestock helped, sheep for wool, goats and cows for milk, pigs for meat, but even animals required grazing land, which was scarce and contested. In this environment, survival meant adaptation. Some stayed and wrestled with the soil, but others looked outward, toward the horizon. The sea was dangerous, but it was also opportunity. Beyond the waves lay fertile lands, wealthy monasteries, bustling towns, and rich trade routes. For a people hemmed in by nature's limits, the ocean promised release. And so the Viking expansion was not a sudden explosion of violence, as later chronicles often suggest, but a slow unfolding necessity. Population pressure grew as families expanded. The oldest sons inherited farms, leaving younger brothers with little. Some sought fortune through trade, some through service to local chieftains, and some through the only path left, the sea. To sail was to survive, and to conquer was to thrive. Yet it was not only hunger that drove them. The Norse lived in a culture that prized honor, reputation, and the pursuit of glory. A man's worth was measured not merely by his farm or his wealth, but by his deeds, by the stories sung of him around the fire. Raiding, exploring, trading, all were paths to prestige. To return home with silver spices or foreign tales was to raise one's standing in the eyes of kin and community. To return with nothing was shameful, a mark of wasted opportunity. Their myths and sagas reflected this ethos. The gods themselves were wanderers and warriors. Odin the All-Father was a seeker of knowledge, often venturing far in disguise to learn hidden truths. Thor, the Thunderer, traveled across the worlds battling giants at the edges of creation. To sail beyond the horizon was not merely practical, it was sacred, an imitation of divine journeys. By venturing into the unknown, men aligned themselves with the gods, proving their courage and earning the possibility of everlasting fame. The political landscape added further pressure. Scandinavia was divided into many small kingdoms, each ruled by jarls and petty kings. Power shifted constantly, alliances were fragile, and wealth was the key to influence. A chieftain who could provide treasure to his warriors, rings, weapons, exotic goods, ensured loyalty. Without such wealth, his men might abandon him for a stronger leader. Raiding and trading across the sea provided the silver and gold that fueled this political game. In a sense, survival at sea was not only about keeping men alive on voyages, but about keeping power alive back home. Trade was as vital as warfare. The Vikings were not merely raiders, they were merchants who connected the distant corners of the medieval world. From the Baltic, they carried furs, amber and slaves. From the east along the rivers of Russia, they brought silver from the Caliphate, silk from Byzantium, spices from the markets of the Middle East. Their ships reached as far west as Newfoundland, as far south as North Africa, and as far east as the Caspian Sea. Each voyage carried risk, but each voyage also carried possibility. Imagine for a moment, a small village on the Norwegian coast, wooden houses clustered around a narrow fjord, smoke rising from hearth fires, goats grazing on rocky slopes. The people there live close to the earth, yet their gaze is often fixed on the water. A longship rests on the shore, tar still fresh on its hull. Families gather provisions, dried fish, bread, ale. The men sharpen weapons and mend sails. Children watch with wide eyes as fathers and brothers prepare to depart. Some will raid, some will trade. All will vanish beyond the horizon, their fates uncertain. For the families left behind, departure was bittersweet. On one hand, it promised wealth, honor, and survival. On the other, it risked death at sea, or worse, death in a foreign land, with no one to carry their name home. Songs and prayers filled the air as ships pushed away from shore, for the sea demanded respect, and the gods demanded sacrifice. To the Norse, the world itself seemed vast, yet interconnected. They did not see their fjords as isolated corners of Europe. They saw them as gateways, narrow mouths opening into an endless expanse of possibility. Each voyage stretched the known world wider, each return carried news of distant places, strange customs, foreign gods, and with each story, the imagination of the Vikings grew bolder. If rivers could carry them to the Black Sea, why not to the very edge of the world? If one monastery could be plundered, why not an entire kingdom? If one cask of ale could last a week, why not find ways to last a month or 2, or 3? This is why survival at sea mattered so deeply. It was not a mere question of endurance, it was the key to their entire way of life. Without the ability to cross oceans, the Viking Age could not have unfolded. No raids, no colonies, no sagas of faraway lands. Their thirst, their hunger, their ingenuity aboard those fragile ships, all of it was bound to their destiny. The North Sea was not only a barrier, it was the thread that stitched the Norse people into the fabric of history. And so when we ask why the Vikings risked their lives on the ocean, the answer is layered. They sailed because they hungered for food, because they hungered for wealth, because they hungered for glory. They sailed because their land could not hold them, and their spirits could not be contained. They sailed because the horizon called, and to ignore it would be to wither. In the end, the Viking world was shaped by contrasts. Harsh land and fertile abroad, scarcity at home, and abundance overseas, danger at sea and wealth upon arrival. These contrasts fueled their courage, sharpened their skills, and hardened their resolve. The sea was merciless, but so too was the life they left behind. Between these two harsh realities, they chose the path of the horizon, and thus the stage is set. To understand their survival at sea, we must now look at the vessel that carried them, the marvel of wood and design that turned their hunger into history, the Viking longship. If the sea was the Vikings' greatest adversary, the longship was their greatest ally. More than wood, nails, and tar, it was the very heart of the Viking Age, a vessel that carried them across rivers, through storms, and over oceans, once thought impassable. Without the longship, there would have been no raids, no settlements, no sagas carved into memory. It was both weapon and sanctuary, fragile yet enduring, as vital to survival as the food and water stored within its hull. The longship was a marvel of engineering, centuries ahead of its time. To understand it, we must imagine not just a boat, but a living creature, sleek, strong, and flexible. Its design was unlike the bulky merchant vessels of the Franks, unlike the Mediterranean galleys with their deep hulls. Viking longships were long, narrow, and shallow, their keels low enough to skim over rivers, yet strong enough to endure the pounding waves of the open sea. With such ships, the Vikings could sail where others could not, slipping silently up rivers, landing directly on beaches, or cutting swiftly across the sea with the wind at their back. Imagine standing beside one as it rests on a fjord's edge. The hull gleams with fresh tar, the wood smelling sharp, the dragon-headed prow rising proudly as if to challenge the horizon. The sides are lined with shields, not only as protection, but as a declaration of strength. Each plank is fitted with precision, overlapping in a technique known as clinker building. This gave the ship both strength and flexibility, allowing it to bend and sway with the sea, rather than splinter against it. In this detail lies the genius of Norse craftsmanship. They built ships that breathed with the ocean. Inside the vessel, the space was spare. There was no deck in the modern sense, only open boards where the crew sat, rowed, ate, and slept. Cargo and provisions were stored in the center, tied down with rope to prevent shifting during storms. Wooden casks of ale, mead, or water occupied precious space, their preservation a matter of life and death. Dried fish and meat were wrapped in cloth, tucked into corners, carefully rationed. Every inch of space mattered, for the difference between survival and starvation might be a single barrel, a single bundle of bread. The longship was not built for comfort. The men slept where they sat, sometimes curled on cloaks, sometimes lying on bare boards, their bodies stiff and damp from the spray. Rain and cold seeped into every seam, wind tore at clothing, salt crusted hair and skin. And yet, despite these hardships, the ship itself gave them something greater: speed and mobility. A well-built longship could travel up to 100 miles in a single day, with favorable winds. With oars it could push forward even against the current, though at the cost of aching arms and blistered hands. This speed meant not only swifter raids, but shorter time at sea, and thus fewer days rationing dwindling provisions. Navigation, too, was tied to the longship's design. With a shallow draft, the ship could enter narrow inlets and rivers, where fresh water and food might be found. The crew could drag it ashore if needed, turning it on its side to dry, repair, or even sleep beneath for shelter. Unlike larger vessels that demanded harbors, the longship lived as freely as its crew, needing only the will of men to move it from place to place. This flexibility meant survival, for when storms threatened or supplies ran low, the Vikings could adapt swiftly, altering course, finding refuge, seeking streams along foreign coasts. But the longship was more than tool, it was also symbol. To step aboard was to step into destiny. Each voyage was a bond between man and vessel, a pact sealed in tar and sweat. The ship was adorned with carvings, often of beasts or dragons, meant to protect the crew and strike fear into enemies. Its prow cut the waves like a spear, reminding sailors that they were not drifting aimlessly, but charging forward into history. Around the fire, skalds sang of ships, as if they were companions, brave and loyal, sharing the burden of danger and triumph. Yet for all its glory, the longship had limitations. It offered little shelter from storms. A sudden squall could drench crew and cargo alike, soaking provisions, spoiling food, and fouling water. In such moments, the very openness that made the ship versatile became its curse. Men huddled beneath cloaks, prayed for the storm to pass, and guarded their casks with desperation. The ship itself could endure, its planks flexing with the waves, but its human cargo might not. Thus survival aboard the longship was always precarious, balanced on the edge between resilience and ruin. Consider also the weight of its dual purpose. The ship had to carry warriors and weapons, but also the fragile necessities of life: drink, food, tools, even livestock on longer journeys. Every choice mattered. To bring more weapons was to risk less water. To bring more food was to sacrifice cargo for trade. Leaders had to decide carefully, for a miscalculation could doom the voyage before the first oar touched the water. Despite these challenges, the Vikings trusted their longships absolutely. They knew their strength, their quirks, their moods. They patched leaks with tar, reinforced weak planks, replaced oars worn down by endless use. In every hammer blow, every stroke of the adzes, every caulking of pitch, there was a kind of reverence. These ships were not lifeless machines. They were companions, as vital to the Norse identity as the gods themselves. Picture again the crew aboard. The ship rocks with the rhythm of waves. Men row steadily, each stroke timed with the next, their backs bending, their breath fogging the air. The sail bellies with wind, snapping sharply. Beneath them the ship groans but does not falter. It carries them forward through salt and storm, toward lands unseen. They trust it as they trust one another, for without it there is no voyage, no survival, no glory. The longship was in the truest sense a masterpiece of survival. It turned harsh seas into pathways, hostile coasts into opportunities. It allowed the Vikings not merely to endure, but to expand, to conquer, to explore. Every plank carried the weight of ambition, every nail carried the hope of survival. And while thirst and hunger stalked every voyage, the longship gave them the chance to endure long enough to face those enemies. As the prow cuts the horizon, we turn now to the silent adversary that haunted every voyage, an enemy more persistent than storms, more deadly than swords, thirst itself, the eternal foe of sailors upon the endless sea. Of all the dangers that stalked Viking voyages, none was so relentless, so merciless, as thirst. Storms could be weathered, enemies could be fought, hunger could be endured for days, but thirst was a foe that crept quietly into the body and mind, stripping away strength, clouding thought, and leaving even the fiercest warrior helpless. To set sail without enough fresh drink was to step willingly into a battle against time itself. The Vikings knew the sea intimately. They knew the sound of waves crashing against the hull, the cries of seabirds warning of land, the subtle shift of the wind that foretold a storm. Yet they also knew the cruel irony that surrounded them. They sailed on water, endless water, yet almost none of it could sustain life. Salt water gleamed invitingly, but its promise was poison. To drink it was to invite death, slow and painful. The science was unknown to them, but the truth was felt in their bones. Salt water does not quench thirst. It worsens it. Its salt forces the body to release more fluid than it gains, shrinking cells, burning the throat, weakening muscles. Men who drank it in desperation found themselves racked with cramps, dizzy, delirious. Their tongues swelled, their eyes sank, and their minds fractured into hallucinations. Stories were whispered of sailors who, maddened by thirst, dipped their hands into the sea, lifted the brine to their mouths, and sealed their fate. For this reason, fresh water was more valuable than silver, more sacred than gold. A chest of treasure, plundered from a monastery, meant little if the crew lacked drink to survive the journey home. Every cask aboard the longship was guarded fiercely, treated as lifelines. Men would ration their gulps, measuring each sip as though it were counted by the gods themselves. They would wet their lips, let the liquid roll on their tongues, and swallow slowly, savoring what might be their last drink for days. The effects of thirst grew in stages. At first there was only dryness, a parched mouth, a scratch in the throat, a longing for cool water. Then came weakness, muscles refusing to obey as they once had, oars feeling heavier with each stroke. Soon thoughts grew sluggish, decisions blurred. Men who had once spoken with confidence now muttered in confusion, forgetting simple tasks, staring blankly at the sea. By the final stages, the body turned upon itself. Skin cracked, eyes dimmed, and breath came shallow. Even the strongest fell to their knees, their swords useless, their courage broken. Picture a Viking warrior, tall, broad-shouldered, his arms thick from years of rowing and raiding. On land, he is unstoppable, a terror in battle. Yet here on the open sea, with no fresh drink, he weakens. His lips split, his head pounds, his vision swims. He reaches for his axe, but it feels heavy, alien. He lowers it again, defeated not by an enemy's blade, but by his own body's need. This was the cruel truth. Thirst was the great equalizer. It reduced kings and warriors alike to trembling figures, kneeling beneath the sky. The crew feared storms, yes, but storms passed. They feared enemies, but enemies could be fought. Thirst, however, lingered day after day, gnawing at spirit and flesh alike. It turned men against one another, for when supplies grew low, suspicion rose with it. Whispers began. Had someone taken more than his share? Had a man stolen a gulp in the night? Trust, the bond that kept a crew alive, was tested by the gnawing thirst that united them in suffering. And yet, amid this torment, there was resilience. The Vikings did not surrender easily. They turned their suffering into ritual, their desperation into determination. When casks ran low, they prayed to the gods, lifting their hands to Odin, to Thor, to Njord, the god of the sea. They invoked rain, begged for clouds, sang to the sky. When storms broke, they stretched out cloaks and bowls, catching every drop as though it were treasure falling from heaven. The first sip of rainwater was like life itself returning to their veins. In the sagas, thirst was often described as trial, a test placed by the gods to measure courage. Just as warriors proved themselves in battle, sailors proved themselves in endurance. To withstand thirst was to show strength of will, the iron resolve that made the Norse feared across the world. Yet even sagas whispered of men lost to it, their bodies cast overboard, claimed by the sea without glory. The silence of thirst was perhaps the most haunting. Unlike storms, which roared, or enemies, who shouted, thirst crept quietly. It hollowed the ship of laughter, replaced stories with silence. Men who once sang rowing songs now muttered only in sighs. The ship became a hushed, heavy place, as though weighed down by an invisible hand. This silence, broken only by the lap of waves, was its own kind of torment. For those listening now, safe in comfort, it is difficult to imagine the depth of such suffering. Yet picture the endless horizon. No land, no river, no spring. The sun climbs high, beating upon bare heads. Salt spray coats lips, stinging but offering no relief. The tongue grows thick, the throat burns, the chest tightens with every swallow of dry air. All around there is water, but none that can give life. This is the Vikings' eternal enemy. The paradox shaped everything about their voyages. It shaped how they stored provisions, how they rationed food, how they watched the skies. It determined the limits of their journeys, the rhythm of their raids, the urgency of their landfalls. For all their skill in battle, their mastery of shipcraft, their courage and cunning, they were still bound by thirst. It was the unseen chain that tethered them to the earth, reminding them that even the bravest sailor remained fragile, human, mortal. And so when we think of Viking voyages, let us not imagine only the clashing of swords or the burning of villages. Let us imagine the quieter, crueler struggle, men staring at the horizon with cracked lips, counting the days, praying for rain. Let us imagine the enemy they could never kill with steel, the foe that rode with them always, silent and invisible. Thirst. The horizon stretched endlessly, but provisions did not. Before setting sail, every voyage began with preparation, with the gathering of food and drink that would stand between life and death. To understand how they endured, we must step back to those moments before departure, when barrels were filled, meals were salted, and families watched their men vanish into the mist. Every great voyage began not upon the sea, but upon the land. Before the longship's prow cut through the waves, before the horizon swallowed the shore, there was preparation. Villages stirred with purpose, families gathered provisions, and entire communities contributed to the survival of the men who would soon vanish into the unknown. For the Vikings, departure was both a practical necessity and a ritual, a blending of calculation and faith. To provision a ship was to decide who lived and who died. In the days before a journey, the settlement hummed with activity. Blacksmiths hammered repairs into weapons and tools. Carpenters checked the ship's planks, sealing seams with tar. Women dried fish over smoky fires, packed bread into cloth sacks, brewed ale, and prepared casks. Children carried bundles, fetched water, and watched wide-eyed as their fathers and brothers made ready to sail. Each member of the community had a role, for a voyage was never just the work of those who sailed, it was the work of everyone left behind. Fresh water was gathered first, filled into barrels and wooden casks. Men tested the lids, sealing them with pitch, to prevent leaks. These containers were heavy and awkward, yet indispensable. Alongside them went ale and mead, not luxuries, but necessities, for their fermented nature preserved them against spoilage far longer than plain water. Every cask that rolled onto the longship's deck was a silent prayer, a fragile promise of endurance. Food came next. Dried fish was a staple. Cod, herring or salmon, salted and hung until hardened, light to carry, but lasting for months. Meat was preserved as jerky, smoked until tough, its flavor strong but its durability unmatched. Hard bread was baked dense and dry, more brick than loaf, able to endure dampness and time. Cheese, sometimes coated in wax, added protein and fat, though it was heavy and reserved for the early stages of travel. Butter was stored in sealed tubs, a precious comfort that could soften the monotony of dried meals. Imagine the long tables of preparation, fish piled high, bread stacked in rows, barrels waiting to be rolled. The smell of smoke and salt filled the air, mingled with the sweet tang of mead. This was not abundance, but preservation, a careful balance of weight, space and endurance. Every morsel had to be considered. Too much food left no room for water. Too much drink left no room for weapons or trade goods. The longship, though a marvel, was not infinite. Choices meant sacrifices. As the ship was loaded, rituals unfolded. Departure was not only practical but spiritual. Families gathered on the shore, voices hushed, as the men who would leave shared final meals with those who remained. The contrast was sharp, laughter and feasting the night before, solemn silence the morning after, a final bowl of porridge, a final horn of ale, a final embrace. Wives pressed charms into hands, children clung to cloaks, elders spoke blessings. Behind every provision was emotion, the knowledge that this food, this drink, might be the last gift given to their loved ones. In the sagas, such moments are described as both sorrowful and proud. A wife might watch her husband depart, knowing she might never see him again, yet also knowing that his courage brought honor to their household. A son might carry provisions to the ship for his father, proud to be part of the preparation, even as fear knotted his stomach. These emotions wove themselves into the fabric of provisioning. It was not only bread and water being packed, but love, duty and memory, and always there was contrast. On land food was plentiful, water was clear, and mead flowed freely at feasts. But aboard the ship, abundance became scarcity. A cask that seemed large on shore became small on the open sea. A stack of dried fish that filled a basket became a ration stretched over weeks. Provisioning was a bridge between these two worlds, between the comfort of the village and the cruelty of the waves. The leaders of the voyage bore the heaviest responsibility. A miscalculation could doom them all. Too little water meant thirst. Too little food meant hunger. Yet too much weight slowed the ship, made it harder to row, harder to escape storms, harder to flee enemies. Commanders weighed each decision carefully, for the balance between survival and disaster was delicate. They knew that men would forgive storms, even forgive battles lost, but they would not forgive a leader who failed to prepare. Superstition also shaped provisioning. Certain foods were considered lucky, certain rituals required before departure. Some carved runes onto barrels, asking the gods to preserve their contents. Others sprinkled ale upon the ground, as offering to Nudad, god of the sea, or poured mead into the waves for Aegir, the giant who ruled the ocean depths. To provision a ship was not merely to pack supplies, it was to weave protection, to bind the voyage with divine favor. On the morning of departure, the shore filled with silence. The longship lay waiting, its hull black with tar, its sail furled. The men carried provisions aboard, each cask heavy upon their shoulders, each bundle tied with care. They stacked them in the center, lashing them down with rope, securing them against the roll of the sea. Mothers and wives stood nearby watching, their eyes wet with pride and worry. Children clutched their hands, peeking at the ship, as if it were a living beast preparing to devour their fathers. Finally, when all was ready, the men gathered for one last feast. It was tradition, a way of celebrating abundance before scarcity, joy before hardship. Horns of ale were raised, songs were sung, stories told, laughter rang out, but beneath it lay tension, the unspoken knowledge that some who feasted would never return. The feast was both farewell and blessing, a way to honor life before confronting the possibility of death. At last the time came. The sail was hoisted, the oars taken in hand, and the ship pushed from the shore. Families waved from the land, voices calling out blessings, prayers, promises to wait. The men aboard looked back one final time, eyes fixed on the village that had given them food, water, and love. Then, with the horizon ahead, and the provisions stowed below, the longship turned toward the sea. Every cask, every loaf, every dried fish carried with it the weight of survival. These humble supplies, gathered in quiet villages, became the difference between life and death on the open ocean. And though storms and battles might await them, though thirst and hunger would soon gnaw at their bodies, the men rowed forward, trusting in the work of their people, the strength of their provisions, and the favor of the gods. It was here in these rituals of departure that survival began. For the Vikings, water was life. Yet, on the open sea, it was also death. The irony was cruel. Endless waves surrounded them, but none of it was drinkable. Salt water, if consumed, brought only agony, burning thirst, sickness, and ultimately death. Fresh water could be carried aboard, sealed into barrels, yet time worked against it. Wooden casks swelled and leaked. Bacteria grew. After weeks, the water turned foul, thick with slime, sometimes even undrinkable. This was the greatest challenge of the sea, not storms, not enemies, not even the cold, but thirst. A man could endure hunger for days, weeks even, but thirst broke him quickly, shriveling his strength, clouding his mind, and leaving him weak before the waves. To solve this, the Vikings turned to one of their oldest companions, fermented drink. Ale and mead were more than luxuries, they were lifelines. Fermentation transformed fragile liquids into something enduring, something that could withstand time and travel. Where water spoiled, ale lasted. Where water bred sickness, mead preserved itself. This was not mere chance. The alcohol, slight though it was, killed harmful bacteria. The fermentation created an acidic environment, hostile to decay. What began as a drink for feasts became, at sea, the very key to survival. Picture the provisioning of a longship. Barrels of water rolled aboard first, heavy and precious, but beside them came casks of ale, brewed from barley, malted and boiled, sometimes flavored with herbs or honey. The ale of the Vikings was not strong, rarely more than a few % alcohol. It was cloudy, thick with grains, a drink as nourishing as it was thirst-quenching, and it could last for weeks without spoiling. Mead was rarer, more precious, but no less vital. Made from honey, it was both sweet and sustaining, rich in calories and flavor. Its alcohol content preserved it even longer than ale. To drink mead on the open sea was a gift of the gods, a reminder of feasting halls and firesides, a comfort against the endless grey of the horizon. For this reason, it was often saved for moments of need, when spirits faltered, when thirst grew unbearable, when men needed not just nourishment, but morale. The rhythm of life aboard the ship revolved around these drinks. In the morning, men might take a ration of ale, thick and filling, to wash down dried bread or fish. At midday, another ration, shared from a horn or wooden cup, passed hand to hand. The sound of ale sloshing in casks became as familiar as the creak of the oars. Even in the darkest hours, when the sea was cruel and the wind bitter, there was reassurance in knowing the casks still held their lifeblood. But ale and mead were not limitless. Space aboard a longship was precious. Each barrel took room that might otherwise be used for food, weapons, or trade goods. Leaders had to calculate carefully, balancing the needs of survival with the needs of their mission. Carry too little ale, and thirst would gnaw at the men. Carry too much, and the ship slowed, its weight dragging against the sea. Every voyage was a gamble of proportions, an arithmetic of life and death. Water was still carried, for it was lighter and more abundant, but the Vikings understood its fragility. When barrels were first opened, the water was clear and cool, as fresh as the streams of their homeland. Days later, it began to taste stale. Weeks later, it soured. Men often mixed this water with ale, diluting the drink, stretching the supply, while still preserving it. In this way, ale became both shield and companion, protecting the water itself from its own decay. Imagine the moment when a cask was opened, the wooden lid pried away, the liquid within sloshing. If it was water, men leaned forward cautiously, sniffing, judging whether it could be swallowed. If it was ale, relief swept through them. They dipped their cups, passed them along, drinking deeply, the taste bitter and grainy, yet soothing. In that moment, ale was more than drink, it was hope. There is evidence too that Viking sailors understood the dangers of drunkenness at sea. Strong drink was for feasts, for the halls of their chieftains, not for the longship. On voyages, they relied on ale of low strength, just enough to preserve, not enough to impair. A man rowing or steering needed clear senses, strong arms, and quick reactions. Too much mead, too much ale, and disaster would follow. Thus drink was rationed, carefully measured, as surely as food. And yet in this balance of necessity, there was also joy. Even aboard a longship, surrounded by waves, men found comfort in the ritual of drinking together. A shared horn, passed from hand to hand, was more than sustenance. It was fellowship, the reminder that they were not alone in the vast emptiness of the sea. Songs were sung, quiet laughter shared, stories told. Ale and mead were bridges, connecting men to their homeland, their gods, and one another. The sagas too are filled with the imagery of drink. Mead was said to be the drink of the gods, flowing in Valhalla's great halls. Ale was the staple of warriors, the drink of daily life. By carrying these drinks aboard, the Vikings carried their culture with them, their myths and their memories, woven into the very liquid that sustained them. Each sip was not only survival, but identity. Contrast is powerful here. On land, ale was plentiful, brewed in every home, drunk daily with meals. Mead flowed at feasts, sweet and abundant. But at sea, these same drinks became precious, measured out in rations, guarded with care. What was ordinary on land became extraordinary on the waves. To lift a cup of mead while the ship rocked upon the sea was to taste home itself, distilled into honey and water. There were dangers too. A cracked barrel, a leak in the wood, could mean disaster. A storm might toss the ship, spilling precious liquid into the bilge. Men guarded the casks with vigilance, lashing them down, checking them daily. Each one was a treasure chest, holding not gold or silver, but survival itself. In times of desperation, when water ran foul and ale grew low, men might stretch their supplies with melted snow, rainwater caught in sails, or even dew collected from cloth. Yet still, ale and mead remained central, their preservation unmatched. Without them, voyages of months would have been nearly impossible. With them, the Vikings carved their way across oceans, reaching lands as far as Iceland, Greenland, even Vinland, across the Atlantic. Ale and mead were thus more than drink. They were strategy, they were technology. They were the invisible sails behind the visible ones, the unseen oars that pulled them across the sea. For without them, no voyage could endure, and so every barrel rolled onto the deck, carried with it not only liquid, but life. When the longship pushed away from the shore, the families waving, the gods watching, the provisions stacked high, there was always this question: would the casks last? Would the ale preserve? Would the mead endure? The men did not know, they only trusted. Trusted in their brewers, in their leaders, in their gods, and in the power of drink to carry them across the endless sea. And so, sip by sip, horn by horn, the Vikings outwitted the problem of water. The ocean might surround them with thirst, but within their casks lay the answer: cloudy ale, golden mead, the liquid thread that tied their survival to their homeland. The Vikings were practical men. They understood that ale and mead could sustain them for weeks, but never forever. On the open sea, there was always the risk of running dry. No matter how carefully they rationed, how tightly they sealed their casks, there came a day when the barrels stood empty, and when that day arrived, every man aboard looked upward, praying for rain. Rain was both blessing and torment. The sea itself stretched endless and useless around them, a reminder of their thirst. Yet above, the sky held the cure. A passing storm could mean salvation, if only they could catch its gift. The Vikings knew this. They prepared for it. Their longships, with their wide sails and open decks, were tools not only for travel but for survival. When the rain came, men leapt into action. The sail, usually a weapon against the wind, became a canvas for life. Lowered and stretched wide, it caught the falling drops, funneling them into waiting buckets, or directly into their mouths. Hands reached upward, cupped and trembling, catching what little they could. Helmets, shields, even hollowed wooden bowls became vessels of salvation. The deck itself turned slick, and men licked the planks, desperate to taste the cool purity of the sky. There are stories of sailors in every age who drank rain as if it were wine, savoring each swallow. For the Vikings it was no different. Each drop was a miracle, each cup a reprieve from despair. And yet, rain was fickle. A storm might bring torrents one day, then vanish for weeks. The ocean played cruel games, thunder clouds in the distance, lightning flashing, but no relief falling where they sailed. In such times, thirst gnawed at them with merciless teeth. The sagas do not dwell much on thirst, but archaeology and later accounts remind us of its toll. Men, driven by desperation, searched for water wherever it could be found. When rain failed, they turned to the ocean itself, salt water, their eternal enemy. Some, maddened by thirst, tried it anyway. They scooped it with trembling hands, lifted it to cracked lips, and swallowed. For a moment there was relief, but soon came sickness, the mouth drying, the tongue swelling, the stomach revolting. The body, tricked by false promise, only weakened faster. Those who drank too deeply sealed their fate. Salt water was death disguised as salvation. Others sought dew at dawn. At first light, cloth was spread across the deck, over oars, even across the shields. When the morning mist settled, drops of water clung to the fabric. Men wrung it out, drop by precious drop, licking their fingers for even the smallest trace of moisture. It was slow, painful work, yielding so little. Yet when thirst had hollowed them, even a few drops felt like a feast. Snow and ice, too, could be gathered in northern voyages. In the chill of the North Atlantic, ice sometimes drifted near. Men chipped at it with knives, held it in their mouths, letting it melt slowly, soothing their throats. But ice alone was dangerous. It cooled the body, numbed the limbs, and in great quantities brought weakness. Still, it was better than nothing. The Vikings also used their ingenuity with sails. When rain threatened, they sometimes treated cloth with animal fat or tar, making it more water-resistant, better able to funnel liquid into containers. This was no delicate art, but a desperate adaptation, the kind born of countless voyages and endless necessity. For a ship without water was a ship of ghosts, waiting to be claimed. Imagine the silence aboard when water grew scarce. Voices hushed, movements slowed, each man's thoughts turned inward, his body focused only on enduring. Hunger made men restless, thirst made them still. Even the sea itself seemed quieter, as if it mocked them with its endless abundance. When the first drops of rain finally struck the sail, the sound was like drums of victory. Men scrambled, laughing, crying, pressing their faces against the wet fabric, as if against a lover's skin. In that moment, they were reborn. Desperation methods were never enough for long. Dew, snow, ice, even the rare fish whose fluids could be wrung from its flesh, all these gave only temporary reprieve. Rain was the true salvation, but it could not be summoned. This uncertainty shaped the very rhythm of Viking voyages. Leaders planned carefully, choosing seasons when rains were more frequent, avoiding the dead calm summers of certain seas. They read the sky with hungry eyes, searching for clouds that might offer deliverance. It is easy to forget, in imagining these seafarers as fierce warriors, that they were also fragile men. Their ships were strong, their weapons sharp, their courage vast, but their throats could still dry, their lips still crack, their bodies still wither from thirst. In the end, survival did not come from strength alone, but from cleverness, patience, and sheer endurance. The sagas often describe storms as trials sent by the gods, but perhaps thirst was the crueler trial. A storm tested their skill and bravery for hours, thirst tested their will for weeks. There is something profoundly human in imagining these men, Fierce raiders, proud explorers, reduced to waiting with open mouths for rain, hoping for mercy from the sky. It strips away the myth, leaving the truth that survival at sea was always precarious, always uncertain, always on the edge of despair, and yet they endured. They found ways, rain caught in sails, dew wrung from cloth, ice chipped from drifting floes. Even in their darkest hours, the Vikings proved resourceful, unwilling to yield. For them, every drop mattered, every trick, every method, was another chance to see land again, to feel grass beneath their feet, to drink deeply from streams and wells once more. To survive the sea was not only to conquer waves and winds, but to master thirst. This was the hidden battle of every voyage, the silent war fought not with swords, but with patience and desperation. And in this war, the Vikings time and again found ways to endure. When we think of survival at sea, water always comes first to mind. Yet the Vikings knew that liquid was not the only way to keep thirst at bay. Food, too, could be a quiet ally. The very meals they carried aboard their longships were chosen not only for their sustenance, but also for their ability to ease the dryness of the throat, to give the body hidden reserves of fluid when water was scarce. This was not accidental. Centuries of trial, of voyage, of bitter lessons learned from loss, taught the Norsemen what foods endured the sea and what foods offered more than mere calories. To understand their survival, we must look not only at what they drank, but also at what they ate. The most essential staple was dried fish. Cod, herring, and other North Atlantic catches were gutted, salted, and left to dry in the cold air until they became as hard as wood. At first glance, such food seems the enemy of hydration, dry, salty, and difficult to chew. It offered little relief to parched lips. Yet the Vikings knew how to prepare it. When soaked in water, even brackish water strained through cloth, or better still in rainwater, the fish softened, and some of the salt leached away. It became edible again, nourishing, and far less harsh on the body. In times of plenty, they paired it with ale or diluted mead, turning the driest fare into a sustaining meal. But fish alone was never enough. Alongside it, they carried dried meats, often pork or beef preserved with salt and smoke. These were dense, long-lasting, and heavy with protein and fat. Yet, like dried fish, they required liquid to be kind to the body. For this reason, meat was often eaten sparingly, unless water or ale was at hand. Still, in small amounts, it gave strength for the labor of rowing, the pulling of ropes, the long watches at sea. The Vikings understood balance. Too much salted food without drink could worsen thirst, but in measured portions, it sustained life. Grains and bread offered another source of hidden hydration. Flatbreads baked hard for the journey, porridge made when liquid was available. These could carry water into the body in ways less obvious than drinking alone. A porridge of barley or oats simmered in rainwater, or weak ale, gave not only calories, but also fluid. Even when no fresh liquid was at hand, the mere act of chewing bread slowly, letting the saliva soften it, allowed the body to reclaim moisture drop by drop. It was slow relief, but relief nonetheless. Dairy too played a role. The Vikings were herders as well as raiders, and they brought with them products made to last: hard cheeses, butter, and sometimes whey. Cheese, though salty, contained water locked within its fat and protein. A piece of cheese eaten at sea did more than fill the stomach. It eased thirst ever so slightly, giving the body what little fluid it held. Butter, rich and dense, provided energy, but little hydration. Yet even this, when spread on bread or mixed with dried fish, helped the body conserve strength, slowing the wasting effects of thirst and hunger combined. Perhaps the most overlooked source of water at sea was the very fruit of the land they left behind. Dried berries, bilberries, lingonberries, even cloudberries from the far north were carried in sacks. Though shriveled, when soaked in liquid they plumped again, releasing both flavor and water. Even when eaten dry, they yielded traces of juice, tart and sharp on the tongue, awakening saliva, tricking the body into feeling less parched. In desperate moments, this alone was a small mercy. On rare voyages, when circumstances allowed, livestock were brought aboard: chickens, sometimes goats, even the occasional sheep, provided fresh food during the journey. More importantly, they could provide fluids indirectly. Eggs offered both nourishment and a surprising amount of water bound within their whites and yolks. Goat's milk, though harder to store, could be consumed when available, a drink as precious as rain itself. Such luxuries were not common, reserved for longer or more uncertain voyages. But when they appeared, they meant survival. Food and drink, in truth, were not separate in Viking thought. They were part of the same equation: how to sustain life when surrounded by an ocean that offered nothing safe to swallow. The sagas hint at this connection. Meals are described not simply as feasts, but as moments of restoration, when strength and spirit alike were renewed. Even at sea, when meals were plain and harsh, the act of eating was a way of fighting back against the ocean's hunger. Each bite was a defiance, a way of saying, "We will endure." The psychological power of food cannot be overstated. Thirst gnawed at the men, making their tongues heavy, their tempers short. A meal, even a small one, offered distraction and relief. The chewing of bread, the savoring of dried berries, the slow softening of fish, these occupied the mind, eased despair, and reminded the crew that survival was still possible. In this sense, food was more than sustenance, it was hope given shape, yet there was always danger. Too much salted meat, without enough liquid, could push a man closer to death. Too much reliance on dry grains could parch the mouth further. The Vikings knew this balance. Instinctively, they rationed not only their drink, but also their meals, choosing what to eat according to what liquid was at hand. When ale or rainwater was plentiful, they ate more freely. When water was scarce, they chewed sparingly, conserving saliva, delaying the inevitable. One can imagine the rhythm aboard the ship, the leader deciding when to open the barrels of ale, when to distribute cheese or dried fish, when to allow porridge to be made from dwindling grain. The men waiting, hungry and thirsty, trusting in the wisdom of their leader. Each decision carried weight. A poorly timed meal could worsen thirst. A carefully chosen one could carry them another day closer to land. The sea demanded not only strength of arm, but wisdom of stomach, and so the Vikings, fierce in battle, cunning in trade, also proved patient in diet. They ate with care, understanding that every bite was part of their survival strategy. Their food was not merely sustenance, but a companion to their drink, a quiet ally in the eternal struggle against thirst. In the end, their survival depended on this balance. Ale, mead, and rain kept them alive, but food made that life possible. Without grain, without fish, without cheese and berries, the body weakened too quickly, and even water could not restore it. Together, food and drink formed a partnership, one that carried the Vikings across oceans, from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Russia, from the icy seas of Greenland to the green shores of England. To study what they ate is to glimpse the hidden threads of their endurance. It is to see that survival was not only about bravery or battle, but about the quiet wisdom of choosing the right meal, at the right time, in the right way. For the Vikings, food was not only fuel for the body, but a hidden source of water, a silent weapon against the endless thirst of the sea. Not every enemy the Vikings faced carried a sword or an axe. Some enemies crept silently into their bodies, striking without warning, leaving them weak and helpless, even as the ocean roared around them. Among these unseen threats was one that haunted seafarers for centuries: scurvy, the slow, merciless thief of vitality. Though the Vikings did not know the word scurvy, nor understand the science of vitamins, they knew its shadow. They saw the way a man who had once been strong and eager could grow pale and exhausted. They saw gums swell and bleed, teeth loosen, wounds that once healed swiftly now refusing to close. They saw comrades lose their strength not to battle, but to something hidden within. Scurvy arises from the absence of fresh food, especially the absence of fruits and vegetables, rich in what we now call vitamin C. For sailors who spent weeks or months on the open sea, living on dried fish, salted meat, and hard bread, such nutrients were all but absent. Day after day, week after week, their bodies quietly ran out of the reserves that kept them whole. What followed was weakness, pain in the joints, swollen limbs, and eventually death, if relief did not come. To the Vikings, these symptoms must have been mysterious, even frightening. A warrior who had endured countless battles could suddenly collapse when no blade had touched him. Men whispered of curses, of the sea god's anger, or of hidden sickness carried by the wind. The Norse sagas do not name scurvy directly, but hints remain, stories of men growing weak on long voyages, of sickness striking not with fever, but with slow wasting. These may well be echoes of the disease, yet even without knowing its cause, the Vikings sometimes stumbled upon its cure. The north was harsh, but it gave them certain gifts. Berries such as cloudberries, lingonberries, and bilberries grew wild in their homelands. When dried and stored, they carried a measure of the life-giving nutrient within them. On voyages where such berries were brought along, the men fared better, though they did not know why. To them berries were simply a welcome taste of the land, tart and refreshing. In truth, they were a shield against the silent killer. Other times, survival brought them into contact with fresh sources of nourishment, unexpectedly. Raids on foreign shores yielded fruits and vegetables the men had not seen in months. Trading voyages to more temperate lands introduced them to oranges, cabbages, and herbs. Even the simple act of stepping ashore, hunting or gathering fresh plants, could mean the difference between decline and recovery. The Vikings did not see these moments as medicine, but they were. Still, the risk remained constant. For every voyage that ended with new supplies gathered, there were others where weeks stretched into months, and the food held no remedy. The slow decline of a crewmate would weigh heavily on morale. Men already exhausted by rowing, chilled by spray, and deprived of rest would now see the strongest among them falter. Fear spread. If he could fall, then so could they. The ocean's vastness became more terrifying when their own bodies betrayed them. One can imagine the scene aboard a longship as scurvy set in. The once rhythmic pull of oars grows uneven as men tire more quickly. The voices that once rang with songs of courage now fall silent. A comrade lies curled beneath a fur cloak, too weak to rise, his gums bleeding, his breath shallow. Others look on helpless, unsure of what curse has struck. The sea stretches endlessly, indifferent to their suffering. Yet the Vikings were not entirely defenseless. Their culture prized resilience, adaptation, and practical wisdom. When one approach failed, they tried another. They knew the value of sour milk and fermented foods, staples in their diet, that though not rich in vitamin C, sometimes carried small amounts of nutrients that slowed the disease's progress. They learned the importance of balance, that too much salted meat without other foods led to illness, and that the rare blessing of berries or greens restored strength. Scurvy was not unique to the Vikings, of course. Centuries later, entire fleets of European explorers would be crippled by it. Tens of thousands of sailors would perish before the discovery that citrus fruits could prevent the disease. Against this backdrop, the Vikings' occasional success in staving it off is remarkable. It shows how their closeness to nature, their reliance on the land and its seasonal gifts, sometimes saved them where later sailors failed. But for the men aboard those longships, the knowledge was never certain. Each voyage was a gamble not only against storms and enemies, but against the silent erosion of their bodies. Some returned home with little more than weariness. Others returned changed, their strength diminished, their teeth missing, their faces hollowed by the hidden disease. And some never returned at all, claimed not by drowning or by sword, but by the slow starvation of a body deprived of what it could not name. In the end, scurvy was one of the great invisible foes of Viking seafaring. It left no tales of glory, no scars to boast of, no heroic songs. But it shaped their journeys, decided their fates, and haunted their long crossings in ways as profound as storms or battles. The Vikings fought not only with steel and courage, but with their very bodies, against hunger, against thirst, and against the quiet, creeping death of scurvy. The Vikings lived in constant conversation with the sea. It was their highway, their battlefield, their promise of wealth, and their greatest danger. No matter how strong the longship, no matter how skilled the crew, the sea remained a power beyond human control. Storms could rise suddenly, turning calm waters into a churning chaos. Winds that once carried them forward could twist without warning, tearing sails and shoving their vessel sideways. And even when the storm passed, the sea left behind its salt, its cold, and its endless demands on the human body. For men who sailed weeks on end, the strain was relentless. Imagine it, a crew of 40, crowded into a ship, no longer than a city bus, open to the sky, exposed to every breath of wind and spray of water. There was no deckhouse, no cabin, no safe place below. When rain fell, they endured it. When waves crashed over the bow, they bailed it. When the sun burned, they baked beneath it. The ship and their own endurance were the only barriers between life and death. The storms were the most terrifying tests. A sudden gale could lift the longship like a toy, sending it crashing down into troughs as deep as houses. Every timber groaned, every rope strained. Men clung to the oars not only to propel the ship, but to steady themselves. Salt water lashed their faces, burning their eyes and drying their skin until it cracked. Some prayed, others shouted to one another above the roar, still others worked silently, each stroke of the oar a desperate act of survival. The body paid dearly in such moments. Muscles cramped with exhaustion, arms shook under the endless pull of the oars, salt water whipped by the wind, seeped into cuts and sores, inflaming them with pain. Lips split, eyes blurred, the skin beneath their clothing grew raw where it was rubbed constantly by soaked wool. In such conditions, even the strongest warriors felt their limits, and storms did not pass in an instant. A gale could last for hours, sometimes days. Sleep became impossible, for to sleep meant letting go of the oar, and to let go might mean losing the rhythm the ship needed to survive. Men collapsed only when their bodies refused to move further, and even then they were sometimes shaken awake by comrades, forced to rejoin the struggle. The storm showed no mercy, and so the men could not either. When at last the winds eased, the aftermath brought no comfort. Every limb ached, eyes swelled with salt, hands bled from rope burn and blisters, and worst of all, there was no escape. The men remained trapped in their floating world, surrounded by the very sea that had just tried to kill them. Unlike land battles, there was no retreat, no running away. Their only choice was to endure, but storms were only one enemy. The sea itself, even in calm weather, carried constant strain. Salt was everywhere, in the air, in the spray, in the very food they ate. Day after day, the men breathed it, tasted it, wore it on their skin. Salt water hardened their clothes, stiffened their hair, and cracked their lips. The constant dampness soaked into their bones, chilling them even when the air grew warmer. The sea clung to them, a second skin that never let go. This salt slowly corroded their bodies. Skin peeled and blistered, joints swelled, cuts refused to heal cleanly. Salt-dried lips bled, teeth ground grit from food, dampened with spray. For those already weakened by hunger or fatigue, the ocean's salt seemed to draw out what little strength remained. And because they could not wash it away with fresh water, water was too precious to waste. They lived in this cycle of irritation and decay. Fatigue was another ever-present burden. The rhythm of rowing demanded strength, hour after hour, day after day. Unlike modern ships, Viking longships had no engines, no sails that could entirely replace human effort. When the wind failed, the men rowed. When tides opposed them, the men rowed. And when storms struck, they rowed all the harder. Their backs bent endlessly, their shoulders groaned, their palms grew raw, their breath rasped with exertion. Sleep was stolen in fragments. Some rested while others rowed, curling beneath damp furs, their muscles twitching even in dreams. The rocking of the ship, the slap of waves, and the sharp cries of comrades kept true rest at bay. Sleep was never deep, it was survival sleep, a desperate half-rest stolen when exhaustion forced it. Over time, this lack of recovery wore the men down. Their movements slowed, their minds dulled, their tempers frayed. Even the strongest warriors grew clumsy when deprived of rest. Oars slipped, orders were misheard, accidents multiplied. And yet the voyage pressed on, for to falter was to drift, and to drift was to risk death by storm, starvation, or delay. Storms and fatigue also tested their unity. The crew of a Viking longship survived only as a group. Each man depended utterly on the one beside him. In calm seas, this bond was a source of strength. But under endless strain, cracks could appear. Anger flared more easily when bodies were weary. Disputes over food, space, or duties might erupt. A harsh word at the wrong time could wound as sharply as a blade. The sagas speak of quarrels aboard ships, of leaders forced to intervene, of men nearly coming to blows. Yet they also speak of the deep trust that grew when comrades endured such trials together, surviving storms side by side. The physical strain of storms and salt left marks on their bodies long after voyages ended. Chronic pain haunted their joints. Scars lined their hands. Vision dimmed from endless squinting into the spray. Teeth worn by grit and hardened bread weakened. Some men never fully recovered from the ordeals. Their health diminished for life. Yet in the eyes of their communities, these signs were proof of endurance, badges of survival against the sea itself. And still, despite all this suffering, the Vikings returned to the waves again and again. Why? Because the rewards were greater than the pain. Raids brought silver, goods and renown. Trade brought wealth and prestige. Exploration brought new lands and new stories. To face the storm was to gamble against death, but also to claim treasures and honor no land-bound rival could match. The strain of the sea, then, was woven into the very fabric of Viking identity. It shaped their legends, their songs, their sagas. The image of the warrior at the oar, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the horizon, became a symbol of endurance. The hardships they endured at sea forged reputations at home. To have survived such voyages was itself a tale worth telling by the fire. Storms and salt punished the body, but they also revealed its limits, and sometimes its surprising strength. A man who believed himself at breaking point might find within him the energy to row another hour, endure another wave, bail another flood. In these moments, endurance was not just a necessity, but a kind of glory, proof that he belonged among the seafarers of the north, that he could stand against the fury of the ocean and return alive. For all the strain, the Vikings understood a truth that modern sailors sometimes forget: the sea never truly yields. It cannot be conquered, only endured, and in that endurance, the Vikings found not only survival but identity. Every scar from salt, every ache from rowing, every wrinkle etched by wind and spray, was a testament to their life between worlds, between land and sea, between survival and death. A Viking longship, though built for strength, speed, and endurance, was still a cramped world of hardship. The endless horizon offered no relief, only repetition: row, bail, eat, sleep, and row again. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the shifting sun, the rising moon, and the constant slap of waves against the hull. In such a life, survival was not only a matter of strength, but of spirit. A man could endure hunger for a time, endure thirst for longer, but despair could sink a ship even faster than the sea itself. So the Vikings, ever practical and ever imaginative, carried with them tools of a different kind: songs, rituals, and small acts of defiance against the monotony and fear. These were not luxuries, but necessities, invisible oars pulling the crew forward when their bodies faltered. The most powerful of these tools was song. The rhythm of rowing demanded unity, and song gave them that rhythm. A steersman or chosen leader might raise his voice first, chanting words older than memory. The crew answered, their oars dipping into the sea in time with the beat. The verses were often simple, easy to remember, but their power lay in repetition. Voices rising together became stronger than any single man's fatigue. Each note filled the air with purpose, each chorus driving the oars forward with renewed strength. Songs carried many forms. Some were chants meant to steady the rowers in storm or calm. Others were playful, even mocking, created to lift spirits in moments of gloom. Still others carried the weight of prayer, songs directed to Thor, to Njord, to the spirits of wind and wave, pleading for safe passage. In their voices, the men wove both hope and defiance, affirming that they were not helpless passengers on an indifferent sea, but warriors who would not go quietly into despair. Music was more than rhythm, it was memory. A familiar tune could transport a man, if only for a moment, back to the mead hall, back to the hearth where his family waited. A verse recalling a feast, a hunt, or a lover's embrace brought warmth into the cold spray. In this way, songs did more than pass the time. They stitched the sea to the land, reminding every sailor that beyond the horizon lay home. Beyond songs, rituals gave the crew structure in a world without walls or clocks. Each voyage began with sacrifices or blessings before departure, offerings of mead, the slaughter of an animal, or the casting of carved runes into the sea. Once underway, smaller rituals continued. Some men carried charms, runestones etched with symbols of protection. Others whispered prayers before touching their oars. A man might rub his hands with salt or trace Thor's hammer in the air before facing a storm. These rituals were not superstition in the dismissive sense. They were anchors. They gave order to the chaos, a reminder that even in the vast, unpredictable sea, there were forces that could be invoked, honored and trusted. For men surrounded by danger, the belief that a god or spirit traveled with them was as vital as bread or water. There were also rituals of discipline. Every crew depended on order. Without it, oars fell out of rhythm, sails snapped, and quarrels flared. Leaders enforced rules with a mix of authority and ritualized respect. Food was shared according to rank and need. Watches were kept with strict fairness. Duties rotated so that no man bore too much of one burden. These practices, carried out consistently, became rituals of their own, binding the men into a machine of survival. When tensions grew, as they inevitably did in close quarters, ritual provided release. A shared toast of the last mead, a chant of victory after weathering a storm, or the telling of sagas by torchlight. These moments eased tempers, knitting wounds before they could fester. Storytelling in particular was a lifeline. A skald among the crew, or simply an older sailor with a sharp memory, could recite tales of gods, heroes, and past voyages. As the ship drifted under the stars, men leaned close to hear of Odin's wisdom, Thor's battles, or the deeds of Ragnar and his kin. These tales, passed from voice to voice, reminded the men that they were part of something larger than themselves, a chain of stories stretching across generations. Coping also took quieter forms. Some men found solace in small personal acts, the carving of wood scraps into charms, the polishing of weapons, the mending of clothes with careful stitches. These tasks gave hands purpose when there was no rowing to be done, and minds a momentary escape from hunger or worry. A simple act of care, smoothing a rough edge of wood, patching a torn cloak, became an assertion of control in an environment that allowed so little. Laughter too was medicine. A well-aimed jest, even a crude one, could cut through despair like sunlight through clouds. Vikings were not humorless men of iron. They were human, prone to the same need for release as any group pressed too tightly together. Jokes, teasing, even mock contests of strength or skill, helped ease tension. A sudden burst of laughter on the open sea was a reminder that life, however harsh, was still worth defending. In this blend of song, ritual and small acts, the Vikings created a world within the ship that was more than endurance, it was culture. The sea tried to strip them of identity, to reduce them to weary bodies, rowing endlessly through salt and spray. But through these coping mechanisms, they reasserted who they were, men bound by brotherhood, by gods, by memory, and by the stubborn will to survive. It is telling that the sagas, written long after these voyages, often preserve not just the battles and conquests, but the songs sung and the rituals observed. The chroniclers knew that such practices were not decorations on the story of survival, they were its beating heart. Without them, the voyages would have collapsed into misery. With them, the Vikings could face the horizon again and again, carrying their strength not only in muscle and steel, but in voice and spirit. So when we imagine the Viking ship at sea, we must not picture only the creak of oars and the crash of waves. We must also hear the deep rumble of voices raised together, see the hands tracing symbols of faith, watch the firelit faces leaning in to hear tales of gods and kings. These were the unseen sails that carried them forward, the invisible waterskins that quenched thirst of the soul. Without them, the ocean would have been unbearable. With them, it became a path, harsh, yes, but navigable, survivable, and even sacred. The sea had tested them. The months had dragged on, marked by salt-stiff clothes, parched throats, and aching limbs, that seemed carved from the very wood of their oars. The Viking sailors had crossed not just distances of water, but vast landscapes of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Yet, when at last the coastline of home rose upon the horizon, all those hardships condensed into a single breath of relief. Imagine the moment, the first sight of familiar headlands, jagged cliffs, or gentle fjords shaped like the embrace of kin. A murmur would ripple through the crew, a surge of energy far greater than food or water could provide. Men straightened oars, struck the water with sharper rhythm, and voices, cracked and tired though they were, lifted in cheer. Home was not just a place, it was salvation, healing, and reward. For the Vikings, returning from sea meant more than survival. It was a chance to restore what the journey had stripped away: the body, starved of nourishment, the spirit, worn thin by storms, and the bonds with family, strained by distance. Step by step, ritual by ritual, they re-entered the world they had left behind, transforming from weary sailors back into fathers, sons, brothers, and warriors. The first act of replenishment was physical. Weeks, even months, of salted fish, dried meat, and thin porridge had left bellies shrunken and bodies craving richness. Homecomings were often marked by feasts, not only to celebrate survival, but to repair what hunger had hollowed. Cauldrons simmered with fresh meat, fat loaves of bread, warm from the hearth, and horns of ale filled to brimming. Each bite was more than food. It was medicine, reawakening strength. The body, so long in deficit, absorbed these meals with gratitude, rebuilding what had been sacrificed to endurance. Water, clear and sweet, flowed from streams and wells. To a man who had swallowed brine or sipped stale barrels for weeks, that first draught of fresh water was nothing short of holy. He could drink without ration, without guilt, and feel life flood back into him. The very taste reminded him that he was safe, that no storm could deny him this simple gift any longer. But if the feast healed the body, reunion healed the heart. Families rushed to the shore to greet their sailors, filling the air with cries of joy. Children, who had grown taller in their absence, clung to fathers' legs, wives wrapped arms around shoulders, hardened by toil, and elders gave thanks to the gods for safe return. In those embraces, the sea's distance vanished, and men once again remembered why they had endured. The homecoming was also a communal event. A voyage was never only for the sailors, it was for the village, for trade, for honor, for survival itself. So when a longship returned, its safe landing was celebrated by all. Songs were sung, fires lit, and tales began to spill from lips still salt-cracked. The hardships, once endured in silence, now became stories to be shared, exaggerated, laughed over, and passed down. Through this telling, suffering was transmuted into memory, and memory into legacy. Yet replenishment was not only outward, but inward. Many Vikings believed they carried the favor or disfavor of the gods across their journeys. Returning home required thanks. Offerings were made at temples or simple altars, mead poured upon the ground, animals sacrificed, runes carved and placed upon sacred stones. In these acts, sailors acknowledged that their survival was not their doing alone. Whether Thor had beaten back storms with his hammer, Njord had steadied the waves, or Freyja had guided them with unseen hands, thanks had to be given. Without this closure, the sea's grip would linger too long in their minds. The rituals of cleansing were equally important. Bodies salt-crusted and weather-beaten were washed in rivers or warmed in steam baths, sweat lodges where dirt and weariness could be expelled. This was no mere luxury. To scrub away months of grime was to symbolically shed the sea itself, to return fully to the realm of land. The act of cleansing told the sailor, "You are home again, no longer adrift, no longer at war with waves." As bodies healed and spirits lightened, the mind began to reflect. A sailor might sit at the hearth, watching fire crackle, and measure himself against what he had endured. He would remember nights when thirst gnawed so fiercely, he doubted he would see dawn. He would recall storms where the ship seemed certain to shatter, and mornings when his muscles refused to lift the oar. Yet here he was, alive, warmed, with a horn of ale in hand. Survival brought gratitude, and gratitude bred resilience. The voyages were not without scars. Some returned weakened, some scarred, others carrying the silent burden of comrades lost to the sea. Their absence was keenly felt. The homecoming feast always bore a note of mourning, as families of the fallen listened to the stories of their last deeds. In this way, replenishment was not complete without remembrance. Memory honored the dead, weaving them into the tapestry of the living. The return home was also renewal of purpose. For many Vikings, the sea was not conquered once and set aside. It was an eternal challenge, always calling them back. But each return gave them time to replenish, not just body and spirit, but resources, to repair ships, to forge weapons, to stock provisions. Rest was never permanent, but it was sacred. It ensured that when the time came to set sail again, men would do so not as hollowed survivors, but as renewed adventurers. There was also joy in the ordinary. After months of cramped decks, a man might take deep pleasure in lying on a bed of furs, stretching limbs uncurled, or simply walking barefoot on solid earth. The smell of pine, the sound of birds, the laughter of children at play, all were luxuries compared to the monotony of waves. These simple things, unnoticed before, became treasures. Homecoming sharpened the value of the everyday, reminding each sailor that life on land, with all its routines, was no less wondrous than conquest abroad. And so the cycle of survival and replenishment continued. The Vikings endured the sea, not because it was kind, but because it tested them, shaped them, and rewarded them with tales worth telling. Yet the sea never defined them fully. Their humanity lay in their return, in the feasts, the laughter, the rituals, the embraces. The sea stripped them bare, but home built them whole again. Thus the story of their survival is not complete without the story of their return. For what good is endurance, if it leads only to emptiness? The Vikings knew that the journey was only half the tale. The other half was the replenishment, the restoration of body and spirit, that gave them strength to face the horizon once more. The Vikings are long gone. Their sails no longer rise against northern skies, their oars no longer cut through dark waters, and their cries of triumph no longer echo across distant shores. Yet their memory remains, not only in the sagas etched upon parchment or the relics buried in the earth, but in the lessons they leave us, lessons carried silently within their endurance, their resilience, and their mastery of survival against the most unforgiving of elements. When we reflect on how Vikings survived months at sea without fresh water, we are not merely studying an ancient technique or an odd curiosity of history. We are glimpsing into the heart of human endurance. We are asking the same questions they must have whispered in the still hours of the night. How much can a person endure? What gives us the strength to continue when the odds defy us? And what legacy do we leave behind when survival itself becomes our greatest achievement? The Vikings' survival at sea was not an accident. It was not luck alone, though luck surely played its part in the toss of waves and the mercy of weather. It was preparation. It was community. It was an understanding of nature so deep that it turned the sea from a death sentence into a highway of opportunity. They mastered preservation of food and drink, devised ways to collect rainwater, learned to balance their intake, and endured hunger when no other choice remained. They leaned on each other, bound by trust, and shared every hardship together. In their survival we find an ancient mirror reflecting truths still relevant to us today. The first lesson is endurance. To live upon the sea for months without fresh water close at hand demanded not only clever solutions, but sheer mental strength. The Vikings accepted suffering as part of life. Thirst, hunger, storms. These were not excuses to falter, but trials to be endured. Today, in our world of comfort and abundance, this endurance feels almost foreign, yet it is still within us. We too face storms of different kinds, the slow grind of uncertainty, the tempests of personal struggle, the silent weight of endurance, when days seem too heavy. The Vikings teach us that survival is not the absence of hardship, but the will to move through it, step by step, wave by wave. The second lesson is resourcefulness. A Viking could not call for rescue when his barrels went dry. He could not rely on machines or endless supplies. He had only what his ship, his mind, and his companions could provide. So he adapted. He collected rain in stretched sails, rationed water with discipline, and trusted ancient methods of preservation. He did not lament what he lacked, but instead stretched what he had. This lesson remains urgent for us. In a world where resources are strained and wastefulness often rules, the Viking spirit urges us to adapt, to innovate, to survive not by excess, but by wisdom. The third lesson is community. Alone no sailor could endure. It was the crew, the bonds of trust, the shared oars, the collective endurance that made survival possible. A Viking ship was a floating family, bound together not only by blood, but by necessity. In modern life, where individualism often reigns, this lesson reminds us that survival is rarely a solitary act. We endure best when we endure together, when we lift each other in times of scarcity, when we share not only resources, but hope. The fourth lesson is humility before nature. For all their strength, the Vikings never believed they ruled the sea. They prayed to Njord, god of the waves, to Thor, protector against storms, to Odin, who guided the fates of men. In their rituals, their songs and their silence, they acknowledged the power of the world around them. Today, as we wrestle with changing climates and restless oceans, this humility remains vital. To survive, we must respect nature, not imagine ourselves above it. The Vikings endured because they knew they were guests upon the waters, never masters. And finally, the lesson of perspective. When the Vikings returned from their voyages, they carried more than treasures or tales. They carried a sharpened sense of gratitude for the simple gifts of life: clear water, warm hearths, the laughter of family. Months of deprivation made each sip, each meal, each embrace a miracle. Their hardship transformed ordinary comforts into treasures. In our modern world, where convenience often dulls our sense of wonder, their story asks us to remember, to pause when we drink clean water, to feel gratitude for a meal, to see abundance where once we might have seen only routine. The legacy of Viking survival at sea is not locked in the past. It whispers to us still. Every time we face difficulty, we can imagine the longship cutting through grey waters, its crew weary but unbroken. Every time we find ourselves uncertain, we can picture men raising their eyes to the horizon, trusting that land would appear if only they endured a little longer. And every time we drink water without fear of thirst, we can honor those who once rationed drops as though they were life itself. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine yourself aboard such a ship. Feel the roll of waves beneath you, the sting of salt upon your lips. Imagine the thirst, the weariness, the endless horizon, and then imagine the moment of return, the fresh water, the feast, the embrace of family. That is the arc of survival, the arc of endurance. It is not only history, it is the human condition, timeless and unbroken. And so, as the final chapter of this journey closes, we see the Vikings not as distant figures in horned helmets, though they never wore them, but as people not unlike ourselves. They feared, they suffered, they endured, they returned. Their legacy is not one of conquest alone, but of survival and of the wisdom survival brings. Let this story, as it settles in your mind, remind you of the strength within. You are part of the same lineage of endurance, the same current of resilience that carried longships across oceans. Whether your storms are of water or of life, you too can endure, adapt, and return renewed. This is the true inheritance of the Vikings, not just their raids or their sagas, but their lesson that the human spirit, when tested, can outlast even the endless sea. The sea, it has always been there, long before the Vikings, long before humankind set foot upon its shores. It stretches beyond the horizon, an endless shifting mirror of sky and storm, both beautiful and merciless. For the Vikings, the sea was not a boundary, but a road that carried them to distant lands, to triumph, to despair, and most of all to survival. As we close this long voyage together, we linger for a moment longer with them, upon those waters, letting their story settle into silence, like the tide withdrawing from a shore at dusk. The tale of how Vikings survived months at sea, without fresh water may seem, on its surface, a story of practicality. Barrels of mead, rainwater gathered in sails, fish consumed raw for their liquid, the discipline of rationing, and the ever-present prayer for rain. Yet, underneath those methods, it is a deeper story, one about the human condition itself. Their strategies were born not only of need, but of a spirit unbroken by the vastness of the unknown. Each sip of water was more than refreshment. It was life preserved, courage renewed, and hope extended another day. It is humbling to imagine them, week after week, staring across grey waves, uncertain when land might appear. Some ships did not return. Some men vanished into the sea's dark silence, their thirst never quenched, their families left to wonder. And yet, others endured, guided by instinct, skill, and faith, and they came home. The sagas remember their bravery, but it is in their survival that their truest strength was revealed. In this, the Vikings remind us that survival is not an act of desperation, but an act of meaning. To endure when life becomes fragile is to affirm that every drop of water, every breath, every sunrise matters. Their struggle at sea was not just about reaching land. It was about refusing to yield to despair, refusing to let the vastness of the ocean swallow their will. As you listen now, let yourself feel the stillness of that truth. You are, in a way, aboard their ship. You stand with them as the wind lashes the sail. You wait with them as clouds gather, praying for rain. You sip sparingly from the barrel, knowing it must last. And in that quiet act of imagination, you touch the same thread of endurance that carried them forward. Today we often drink without thought. We pour water, we discard, we never worry that the cup may run dry. Yet the Vikings would remind us that water is never ordinary. It is life, condensed into a drop, delivered to lips parched by salt and sun. To them it was not convenience, it was salvation. And in remembering this, perhaps we can learn to treat the simplest things in our own lives with greater reverence. The eternal sea continues to whisper these lessons. The waves roll as they once rolled beneath Viking ships, carrying memory in their rhythm. The gull still cries, the rain still falls, and though centuries separate us from those long voyages, the truth is the same. Survival is fragile, and it is precious. As this story draws to its close, imagine the Viking sailor stepping ashore after months adrift. He kneels, cupping fresh water in his hands, drinking deeply, letting it run down his throat like fire and relief combined. His body is weary, but his spirit is alive, sharpened by the knowledge that he has endured. That is not only his victory, it is humanity's victory. We too walk through our own oceans of uncertainty. They may not be made of salt water, but of trials, questions, and unseen horizons. And like the Vikings, we find ways to survive. We adapt, we endure, we share what we have, we carry each other through storms. Their story is not just their own, it belongs to us all. So tonight as you rest, let the waves of their journey wash gently through your mind. Feel the calm rhythm of the sea beneath you. Imagine the creak of wood, the sigh of wind, the endless horizon stretching forward. And in that vision, remember that you too are capable of endurance. You too carry within you the strength to survive when times are uncertain, when the waters of life feel vast. The Vikings' legacy does not end in conquest or in myth. It ends here, in a quiet reflection, in the reminder that every drop of water matters, every moment of survival is sacred, and every journey across the unknown can shape us into something stronger. The sea is eternal. It outlasts men and their ships, empires and their kings. But within that eternity, human stories endure as well. The Vikings carved theirs upon the waters, and we remember. And now as the last light fades from this tale, their endurance becomes your inheritance. You carry it forward, silently, steadily, as surely as the tide returns to the shore. The sea has carried us far tonight. We have sailed with the Vikings, felt the salt spray on our faces, and shared in their struggle to survive when the horizon offered no promise but the endless blue. We have listened to their story of thirst, of resilience, of water as life itself. And now the waves grow calm, the sails lower, the oars rest, the voyage draws to a close. As you lie here listening, imagine yourself still upon that longship. The wood beneath you is warm from the sun of the day, and the night sky above is wide and endless. Stars shimmer as they once shimmered for the Vikings, guiding them across oceans unknown. The air is cooler now. The sea is no longer a force of terror, but a gentle cradle rocking the ship softly, steadily, as if the ocean itself wishes to lull its voyagers to sleep. The men around you breathe slowly, their bodies at last at ease, They are no longer straining at oars or watching the skies for rain. They are resting, their heads turned toward the heavens, their minds drifting between memory and dream. You are one of them, and in this moment, you too let go. You too surrender to the rhythm of the water, the rise and fall that has no end and no urgency. The story of the Vikings is a story of endurance, but endurance is not only about action. It is also about knowing when to rest, when to let the world carry you instead of fighting against it. The sea carried them when their strength was gone, just as the quiet can carry you now, easing you toward sleep, toward restoration, toward peace. Breathe in slowly, feel the coolness of the night air fill your lungs. Breathe out, and let your body grow heavier, like an anchor dropping gently into calm waters. Again, a breath in, deep and calm, a breath out, soft and steady. With each breath, the weight of the day falls away, like waves receding from the sand. The Vikings once feared thirst, but you have no need to fear tonight. Here in this quiet space, there is abundance. The air, the water, the stars, all are enough. The world is not harsh here, it is kind. It is vast, yes, but within its vastness there is safety, and within that safety you can let go. As your body drifts further into stillness, imagine rain beginning to fall gently upon the deck. The drops are soft, cool, refreshing. They patter against the wood, they wash across the sail, they slide over your skin. This rain does not bring desperation, but comfort. It is a gift, as it once was to those weary sailors, and now it nourishes you too. Every drop is peace, every drop is calm, every drop is sleep. Far above, the stars remain steady. For the Vikings, those stars were markers of survival, lights that kept them on course. For you, they are markers of rest, quiet guardians of your dreams. Each one flickers like a soft candle, watching over you as you drift deeper and deeper. And as you rest here, carried by the sea of imagination, remember this: the journey is complete. The Vikings endured storms and thirst, but they also found moments of quiet, of laughter, of song. Even at sea, even in hardship, they discovered stillness. That same stillness is yours tonight. It waits within you like a safe harbor, always present, always ready to receive you. The ocean rocks gently, your breath grows slower, your thoughts soften like clouds dissolving into the horizon. You are no longer traveling, no longer searching. You have arrived. Let the waves take you. Let the ship drift. Let the stars shine quietly overhead. Everything is as it should be. The sea is calm, the voyage is over, and you are safe, at peace, drifting into the soft embrace of sleep.